Hello and welcome to Living Writers Online. Today I'm speaking with my colleague Mel Watkins about his memoir, Dancing with Strangers. Thanks so much for joining me today.
It's good to be here. Yeah.
Could we just start with the beginning? Could we start with that wonderful story that your grandmother, Miss Aggie, told you about Dancer that hangs over the whole book, where it comes back at the beginning, comes back at the end. Is it a story that still speaks to you?
Yes, it does. It spoke to me obviously more vividly then, because it has to do with the way you approach the world as a minority in this country, and about what Miss Aggie ultimately talks about when she talks about truth and fact, and appearance, truth and fact being real meaning and appearance is really what she was talking about. Fact being appearance, and truth being the real meaning of a situation, the deeper meaning of a situation. So yes, it does speak to me, and it sort of guided my my life. It guided the way that I found out who I was and what I wanted to be at a certain point. Yes.
Can you say more about that? Like, it guided who you were and who you wanted to be. Dancer is somebody who was of course more than he appeared to be. Who
Yes.
danced, who performed for the white people on the plantation.
And well, that first line, I think, and this is something I should point out. The reason that first line was chosen, it reads, "They called him Lobo," my grandmother whispered, "but his real name was Dancer. Used to be a slave." That really is what the book is about. It's about that progression from feeling like a minority who is an inferior or a lower or a lesser part of the society, the slave, and moving on to something else. And that's why it speaks to me to a certain extent. I didn't realize it when my grandmother told me this. I was 4 or 5 years old. It was a mystery to me. It was one of those things that you think about, and I was trying to figure out what she meant by it. It only occurred to me that it had a much deeper meaning later on. And it says something about another thing that has sort of guided my own life. I started to realize that accomplishment, appearance, is how you convince other people of what you are, at least of what they think you are. Mm-hmm. In the case of Dancer, that is the fact that he was very adept at dancing, that allowed him to create an image of himself in the world that allowed him to get what he wanted to do.
See if this seems right. You grew up in Youngstown, Ohio in the 40s and 50s, graduated from Colgate in the early 1960s, went on to become a book critic, the first Black editor at the New York Times Book Review, gone on to write a lot about African American humor, and now are teaching in the fall semesters courses in the English department here at Colgate. You've written lots of criticism, and you've written work that looks more scholarly. Can you talk a little bit about the impulse to write about your life, to write this memoir? And a second question, before you answer that one, that I'm really dying to know the answer to, is why begin with Miss Aggie's voice, not your own voice? There's something so essentially modest about that, humble in some way. So two questions. Why write a memoir? Why start it that way?
Okay. Why write the? I'll start with why I write the memoir.
Yeah.
The reason I did it is at that time was that I had read a number of memoirs, and most of them were about the South, the Deep South, or about urban life, about people who had come from cities like New York City, Chicago, and so forth. In fact, to mention Claude Brown's Man-Child in the Promised Land, or Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice were two of them. But James Baldwin had written about his life very, very vividly and very, I thought, revealingly at a certain point. He was the writer who had the most influence over me in terms of writing. But you also had Frederick Douglass. You had, in fact, I jotted down a few, Maya Angelou, in fact. There were other people who wrote memoirs. And none of them seemed to have written about the Midwestern experience. about what went on in the Midwest, where you didn't have the gangs and the violence that Claude Brown experienced, and in New York City with the rooftops and the kind of thing that we saw in West Side Story and so forth. You had a different type of upbringing. The weight of the prejudice or segregation was as heavy to a certain extent, but not as apparent. And it certainly wasn't like the Deep South, where people were being lynched, and it was very repressive. It wasn't as overtly oppressive as the South. So what I really wanted to talk about was that Midwestern experience, which was to me, was quite different from either of those scenarios. And therefore, starting with my grandmother was interesting to me because she was talking about something that comes up again and again in the memoir. That is this difference between appearance, between the outside appearance and what really is going on, and how that can be concealed or hidden. And that's the story of Dancer, for instance, is derived from that. That's what she was talking about. I discovered that later. That really was what she was talking about. And talking about the fact that you may even have to be somewhat deceptive in dealing with a society, a situation where people are expecting and only want to see one aspect of who you are. Mm-hmm. So that's why that was chosen. And my grandmother had a tremendous influence over me also in terms of when she moved to Ohio. When she moved to Ohio, I spent a lot of times taking care of her as she moved there when she was very ill, and stayed in our house. And I had not even started school at that time, so I spent time listening to her and taking care of her while my parents were out working. No one was home but me and her. So she was very close to me. It's
one of the most powerful images from the opening sections of the book is you as a very young child, 4-year-old.
Yeah, I think I may have near 5, but yeah. But it says 4, yeah.
In this room, fixing tea for Miss Aggie and listening to her stories.
She was.
It's really marvelous.
And she was very sick at that time. As I remember her, I'd seen her one time earlier in Mississippi. My parents had visited there when she was on her feet and much stronger, but she was a very aggressive, outspoken woman. She was not an easy woman to get along with for most people. She somehow took a special interest in me, and she was different with me than she was with most everyone else. The rest of my siblings did not appreciate her as much. She could be very demanding. So
I want to go back to something you just talked about a moment ago, and what looks on the surface like a discrepancy in the memoir. You say at some point in this book that you didn't actually experience any overt discrimination or segregation growing up in Youngstown. It wasn't until you went with the Colgate basketball team to an away game at Annapolis that you were refused service in a restaurant then. And yet there are moments in this memoir when things happen to you that look a lot like discrimination or segregation. You get caught up in the start of a movie. You walk in late to a movie in the Youngstown Theater, and you sort of, without paying any attention, sit down in the main seats as opposed to in the balcony where you were supposed to sit as a black person, and the usher comes and apologetically tells you have to move. Later, there's a much darker scene when you are arrested on suspicion of armed robbery, and even though you have a watertight alibi and the police are convinced you didn't do it, they force you to go be part of a police lineup.
Yeah.
Yet it didn't feel to you at the time when you were growing up as if Youngstown was a racist place to be. It wasn't until much later. I'm thinking of Baldwin in Notes of a Native Son, that it's actually when he leaves Harlem that he becomes aware, as he says, of the weight of white people in the world.
And the two situations that you brought up occurred at different ages.
Yes.
One in, I think, even preteen.
Yeah.
As with the movie situation, and the latter one while I was in high school. By the time I was in high school, I did realize that Youngstown was very racist.
Yeah.
But when I was younger, and this is part of what the book is about, is this deceptive presentation of reality in the Midwest. That is, it's taken as if it's all, this is the way it's supposed to be. This is not segregation. This is not racism. This is simply the way it's supposed to be. We simply don't serve you here, and everybody knew their place. So if you know your place and you never bump heads with it, you never resist it, you don't see it as segregation or racism. You see it as something else. You see it as just the norm. And that's what it was for me to a certain extent. There's a scene in this book also, I think, where I'm walking home from a Little League game, and a little girl comes up to me and runs out on the lawn and points and says, "nigger." And I had never, that term at that
You're
point.
like, where?
Yeah, I'm wondering what she's talking about, because it meant nothing to me outside of the way it was used in my own house, and that was for someone who was a lowlife, a disreputable person. And I'm walking back with a uniform on from a Little League game, and this happens to me. So it was very, very strange. That was part of it. Part of it was the naivete that goes along with this, the belief at a certain point that this was the norm, the disbelief that people could be as simple-minded as some racists are, that people could actually think that by virtue of skin color that they are better than someone else. And basically, it was a matter of skin color, because I knew people who were passing who were actually African Americans who were totally accepted. So it's the appearance that was the prevailing influence over what really happened in those situations. And so that's what I was talking about. The fact is, since I never challenged, I talk about the fact that I bought hot dogs at the place, which I still think is, I still haven't had a hot dog as well made or as tasty as the ones they served at Jay's Hot Dogs. But blacks were not served. You had to buy them outside at a counter and walk away. You couldn't go inside the restaurant to buy them. But blacks normally, people did it all the time. You'd buy them before you went to a movie or so forth, and nobody even thought about it. You never thought about eating at certain places in downtown Youngstown because blacks simply weren't accepted. It would have caused a controversy. And you simply, at a certain point, as children, we accept the reality that adults present us. It only comes to a certain point where you feel strong enough, aware enough to challenge what seems to be absurdity, and instead of just the norm. I started to feel a sense of self that was beyond what was expected, what I could see in the eyes of others, and what was expected of me, which was virtually nothing. That is, in terms of the people who, my teachers, my parents did not have even high school educations. There were no books in my house whatsoever until I started to read. I started going to the library a lot myself. And then my mother did make an attempt to buy the Funk and Wagnalls encyclopedia, and I think she was able to pay up till N, I believe. And stopped. But it was, this was part of what was going on. But sports did do that. And as I, again, 2 years, by the time I was 14 or 13 maybe, I had grown to my full height of 6'3½". So I started to play basketball. Other people said, look, you should do this. And by the time I got to high school, I was a fairly good basketball player. So I merged. That was, it gave me some status. It gave me the status that allowed me to propel myself into a different level. A level of acceptability, I guess, is what you could call it, in recognition as being not ordinary in the eyes of some people. So, yeah.
So basketball, and really pretty extraordinary skill at basketball. I'm not going to embarrass you by this, but one of the things that I was struck by reading the memoir was by how hard you were on yourself for your basketball career at Colgate, in the sense that you struggled and you never played as easily or naturally as you had back in Youngstown before you went to Colgate. What I want to say is that I have encountered classmates of yours at Colgate reunions and in writing workshops, and I've mentioned your name because they graduated right around the same time you did. I said, do you know my friend Mel Watkins? And they say, oh my, this guy was like a god on campus. He was, everybody knew you. You were regarded as absolutely an extraordinary basketball player. But it was that and grades and SAT scores so high that you were forced to retake the test because
in high school,
people didn't
yes.
believe them back in high school. That got you away from Youngstown, got you to Colgate, got you accepted at other really good schools as well. Dartmouth, for instance, you chose Colgate over Dartmouth.
Dartmouth would have been deadly.
The two schools that were the most like Animal House in those days.
It's interesting that that's true. In fact, isn't Animal House based on Dartmouth, I believe?
It's based on Dartmouth, yeah. Would you be willing to read a little bit from the section about coming to Colgate and maybe talking a little bit about your Colgate experience?
Being here, to answer one of your questions before I get to this, is that part of the acceptance at Colgate in the memory in some people's minds, in my classmates' minds, is that, and this sort of leads into what I'm going to read, is that the expectations from classmates also. Because when I got to Colgate, one of the things that happened is not only, there were two basketball players that came at the same time with highly touted. Bob Duffy, who went on and was drafted and played in the NBA for a while, and I. So the two of us were the athletes that were supposed to bring Colgate basketball to another level. We improved it, but not as much. We had no center. I was the leading rebounder on the team, as a matter of fact. And I was 6'3". We had a center who was 6'5", who couldn't jump, and it's like, so we didn't do as well as we might have done. But the other thing was that I won the Freshman Writing Award for writing an essay about existentialism, and which most of the other students who came here had never even heard of existentialism at that point. So it was a sort of exotic field of knowledge that I had.
So if you were going to be famous for something, it was going to be basketball, not writing the best freshman essay about existentialism.
But on the other hand, they knew that was posted in the I think it was a Caliper. It was the magazine was called at that time, and so people knew about it. And in fact, it imprinted my name in the minds of students in another way besides basketball, put it that way. So I was known for other things, and that was basically what it was. But let me read this to you, and I think this will give you a sense of what it was like when I first arrived here, or at least my reading of what was going on. It starts out, I'd come from the Corn Belt, expecting to find a sophisticated, enlightened environment, and found more cornball insouciance than I'd ever witnessed in Ohio. While I was searching for answers to personal problems, questioning the sovereignty of arbitrary authority, and more practically, trying to figure out how to pay for the books I'd need that first semester, most of my classmates, it seemed, were already on a holiday romp. Besides the business of being introduced to the university's academic regimen, classroom expectations, and registration procedures, that first week was filled with songs, contests, and cheers, activities designed to mold group solidarity and demonstrate our commitment to the greater whole. I was thrilled when the week's festivities were capped by building a huge bonfire. The pep rally that accompanied its lighting was supposed to signal our unity. My classmates' fervor and eager response to those college rites were, of course, not unusual. Isolated and torn away from our roots, almost every freshman had a desperate need for inclusion. During those first few weeks, all of us wanted to feel connected, to belong. And for most of them, it worked. Their compliance with freshman rights, willingness to bend over, fingers to toes, and expose splayed cheeks to requital by the paddle of justice. The paddle of justice was a paddle used by Canosione to punish students who didn't, freshmen who didn't live up to their expectations. When they'd transgressed, for me, symbolized their submission to a social hierarchy that was unacceptable. For many of them, that hierarchy was sacrosanct. Submitting to it was a required homage for establishing contacts, making the hookups that would eventually put them online in a good old boys network that would extend into their workforce and beyond. At the outset, I suspected that those hookups weren't available to Negroes unless we displayed even more obeisance than our white counterparts, bowed and grinned in the face of aggression, in the face of aggressive ridicule that too easily slipped across the line between the joke that it was supposed to be and the deep-seated disdain for blacks that it too often became. My entry was short-circuited from the beginning. As a Negro, I was an outsider, whether I liked it or not. So that was, it sort of displays what I was thinking about when I arrived in that freshman year, and it took me some time to get accustomed to it. As the book points out, I almost left Colgate at that point. In fact, the summer after my freshman year, I attempted to join the Air Force and would have, because I wanted to be a pilot, but they would only accept me as a navigator because my eyesight was beginning to diminish. You had to be 20/20 to be a pilot, so they wouldn't accept me. So I came back.
And you might not agree with this, but I would say from your description of the 4 years here, it got a little bit better in the next few years, but never really good. You chafed at the weather, you chafed at the blatant racism, you chafed at the single-sex school, you chafed at the provincialism that you really didn't expect to find coming from Youngstown, that was even worse than the Midwest. Al Bright, when he came with you to school on the first day with your parents, Tennessee and Katie, right, took one look at Hamilton and said,
Yeah.
"Geez, Pep, what do you think they do in this place for fun?" And you sort of spent 4 years trying to figure that out.
That part of it didn't bother me that much, and yes, it did get better. In fact, by the time I left, by my senior year, it was fine.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of changes had to be made, adjustments had to be made on my part in terms of what to expect. First of all, I lost interest in basketball. For one thing, my eyes were not as good. My eyes, from all the reading, I guess, caught up with me, and my vision went from perfect vision in high school to 20/40 or something. So that was part of it. Secondly, the interest in academics also changed me. I became less interested in basketball and in sports. See, we're talking about an era when sports was unlike what it is today. Had I been going to college now and had exactly the same amount of talent that I had at that point, I probably would have tried to be an athlete because they're paying so much more money. Baseball players at that point, if I was offered a contract by the Detroit Tigers to play in the minor leagues, for instance, I would have been making $120 a month and driving around in the South on buses, playing in small towns during the Civil Rights Movement, which didn't appeal to me at all. In fact, one of my friends from Youngstown, two of us went to try out for the Tigers, and he went on to play for the Yankees. He joined the Tigers and went on to play for the Yankees. But he accepted it and went there. I had the option at that point of accepting a scholarship to a college, and I chose this college scholarship. And in terms of basketball, when I was here, I found that I soon discovered that part of the reason that I put so much interest in basketball was that success in basketball, other things came along with it. I mean, part of it was simply women. It's like playing basketball here was often we played before 70 students in that small gym that is now not even, I forgot the name, what is the name of the old?
Huntington Gym.
Huntington Gym, yes. We played upstairs, and there were, we'd often have 80 people watching the game. I played in high school before 3,000 people, so this was a come down to me to a certain extent. There were no women here. There were no cheerleaders. There was no reward and social reward for playing basketball or being successful for it. So I lost some interest in it, and which was good for me because I became much more interested in something else. And that existential background that you had mentioned earlier, and I mentioned when I talked about the essay, came into play because existentialism to me provided a way of carving out my own identity. I mean, what they talk about, what Sartre talks about is precisely that you can make yourself anything that you want to be. And I bought into that. I just think it makes perfect sense. I would, when I talk to students, in fact now, it's without mentioning existentialism, it's just a simple philosophy that you decide what you want to be and you work at it. You make yourself into that because it's about presentation and accomplishment, so achievement.
Your intellectual education here at Colgate, though, it was complicated too. It's not this is not a simple narrative of Mel Watkins came to Colgate and became less interested in sports and and more interested in academics. I might make a distinction between your intellectual growth, what happened to you intellectually during those 4 years, and your actual academic education, what happened in the classroom, was sometimes a negative education, right? You encountered professors who locked the doors at the beginning of class and droned for an hour reading from notes they hadn't changed in 30 years.
Yeah, some of it was not all that positive.
Right.
I mean, I had very good teachers, and I had some teachers that I found very boring. My advisor, I was a fine arts history major, Fitchin was his name, did give me an F in my junior year of the class because I missed 3 classes. And the last class I missed because I got there 8 minutes after the class started, and he locked the door after 5 minutes so you couldn't get in. So that was my 3rd absence, and it was an automatic F. But I had gotten back from a basketball game in Binghamton at about 4 o'clock that night. It was never even considered an excuse. It's he was strict, and if that's the way it was, if you were late, you were simply late. There was no getting out of it or getting around it. So I ended up taking 6 classes in my first semester, my senior year, in order to make up for it so I could graduate in time. There were also courses like Arnold Seidel's course on the Negro, which I got a C in because we were constantly arguing. He was reading books. He was giving us books to read that made absolutely no sense. We had a course on the Negro, and the only 2 black writers that we read were James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison.
Who's the most fun to teach in the African American humor class?
Well, to me, I still love Richard Pryor, but among the new students, you have to bring it up to date, obviously. So Dave Chappelle is the comic that most of the younger students now know best. Chris Rock is one of my favorites also, but the people that I really like, the students now, many of them don't even know who Richard Pryor is.
Wow.
And Flip Wilson also was one of my favorites, and none of them know who Flip Wilson was. So it's like when I teach those people, I have to bring in tapes and show them exactly what they were about. And once they've seen them, they become a little more open to that experience. But they still prefer Chris Rock. Dave Chappelle is a favorite among those people, the younger people.
Thanks so much for talking with me today.
I enjoyed it. It was fun.